All right, let's come back now to Andrew Scheer's pledge today to cut foreign aid by 25% and use some of that money to pay for his tax cuts and credits. Here's more from Andrew Scheer and a reaction from his opponents.
What I've called for today is a more reinvigorated partnership with our traditional allies through NATO and through countries that share our same commitments to democracy, the rule of law, and peace and security. Stronger ties with countries like Japan and India. What this is pulling money out of things like the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which does not further Canadians' interests, which is controlled by the government of China, to build roads and bridges and other projects in other countries. So this is about reinvigorating our relationship, strengthening our relationship on a multilateral level with our traditional allies and countries that share our same values.
Andrew Scheer's climate plan relies almost entirely on action overseas. And now he's proposing to stop supporting countries who are taking action overseas on fighting emissions. So we see right there that his approach does nothing at home for the environment, and now he's telling us does nothing overseas either.
I think, again, Mr. Scheer is very skillfully distracting people. If we want to talk about revenue, the whole point of his conversation is to talk about revenue. It is shameful that he's talking about cutting foreign aid when there are massive inequalities in our country, where there's just a couple of families that own the combined wealth of 3 provinces. When there is so much income and wealth inequality in our country, the fact that he's talking about cutting foreign aid is a distraction. It misses the point. He's missing the whole plot here. We've got massive inequality in our country, and we have to ask those at the very top, the ultra-rich, to pay their fair share.
All right, let's drill down on what Andrew Scheer is proposing today, that 25% cut in Canada's foreign aid budget. In a moment, I'll be joined by 3 guests who have expert knowledge on how this whole system works. But first, here's a little background. The Department of Global Affairs says Canada spent $6 billion on international assistance in the 2017-2018 fiscal year. The 5 countries receiving the most financial aid from Canada: Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mali, and Nigeria. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has set a benchmark for foreign aid for rich member countries. Canada is counted as one of those. That benchmark is 0.7% of gross national income. Canada currently contributes much less than that at 0.28%. I want to bring in 3 guests now to consider the Conservative promise to cut foreign aid spending and distribute it in a different way to countries that need it most and away from countries and groups that might be hostile to Canada. To do that, let's bring in Stephen Brown, professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, and Nick Moyer is the president of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, also joined today by Bessma Momani, and she's a political science professor at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Bessma Momani, if I can, let me start with you. Let's start with the premise of Andrew Scheer's proposal, which is essentially that medium or upper income countries don't need our help as badly as poorer countries do, and that's where more of the money should be going. What do you think of that approach?
Well, but it's a distraction because that's exactly where we send our money, to the very poorest of countries. I don't understand how Andrew Scheer is asking us to not give money to corrupt governments. We don't give money to corrupt governments. We give money to people who need it, and foreign aid certainly bypasses governments sometimes to ensure that the very vulnerable get foreign aid. But I think it's a bit of a misleading characterization about our foreign aid policy, that somehow we're giving money to wealthy countries that don't need foreign aid and also to corrupt ones. That's simply not what we're doing.
Right. Professor Brown, what's your view on this? He listed countries. He talked about Barbados, talked about Argentina as countries that don't need the money as much as other countries. What's your thought on that?
I completely agree with Bessma. It's a mischaracterization of the actual situation. And if you look at the countries that were named, like Argentina and Barbados, or the so-called hostile countries like Iran or
North Korea, Russia,
we're not sending much money there. The sums are very, very small. Often it's through multilateral programs. In the case of Iran and North Korea, I think it's for tuberculosis and fighting AIDS. So it's not propping up countries that are, enemies of Canada in any way. It's global public goods, and it's very small amounts of money that are just going through some global funds.
Nick Moyer, what's your view on this?
Well, I share the same view. I mean, the fact is that our international assistance targets those who are most in need, and I think that's primarily what it does. There's not much to add.
Okay, so when he talks about countries that are hostile to Canada shouldn't be getting any of our funding, I mean, who's the audience then, Bessma, Momani? If you're all saying that they don't get much of our money and it's going to the people, not them, so what's the purpose of this announcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is to grab a headline, but it is misleading Canadians in many ways, because the implicit point of that is to suggest somehow we do send money to those countries and propping up those governments, which we don't. So it's extremely, I think, troubling in many ways. I think it's important to have the conversation about where we send foreign aid. For Canadians' knowledge, we send most of that to sub-Saharan Africa, to the very poorest. Increasingly, we're sending it to countries that need humanitarian aid, surrounding countries of the Syrian crisis, to help and take care of the millions of refugees there. Similarly, in Afghanistan, we send money to support countries to help come adapt to climate change, and that's a global good. So we don't send money to corrupt governments or to prop up corrupt regimes. It's really very misleading, I'm afraid, and it's a bit disappointing.
Give us a better idea, gentlemen, if I can, a better idea of so Canadians have an idea of where does this money go? We've touched on it a little bit, but what should they know about what Canadian foreign funding does?
Well, I mean, Canadian humanitarian assistance, international development assistance is guided by principles of alleviating poverty and addressing inequality. And really, it's about helping people redress their livelihoods. It's about support for good governance. It's about food security and education. I mean, frankly, it's really about being a contributor to global progress. Obviously, there's many variations to that. International assistance is provided often through multilateral channels, and then oftentimes directly through NGOs, many of which based in Canada. Often included also in the sort of our figures of international development assistance, official development assistance, are other figures that we may not think of, like refugees that we welcome here in Canada.
If Mr. Scheer is elected and he would follow through with this approach, what do you think the consequences are? What does that do to Canada's standing on the world stage?
Well, ironically, this announcement, part of this announcement was criticizing the Trudeau government for its lack of standing in the international system. But this announcement would actually just make things worse. So, I mean, there is a lot to criticize the Trudeau government in international affairs. I'm not going to dispute that. But cutting Canadian foreign aid would just solidify Canada's reputation as a country that doesn't pay its own share, that's a laggard in international assistance. And
when you say solidify, because that's, how to phrase this, we talk a pretty good game on the foreign aid side in this country, but the truth is that, we're nowhere near the OECD target, right?
We're nowhere near the target, and we're not actually at the average. So Canada isn't even an averagely generous country. And that's something that Canadians don't seem to know. We think that we're, doing our share and more, we're very generous. But when you look at the figures, we're below average, and we have been for the past 5 years or so.
But is there an audience? Bessma, Momani, you touched on it perhaps a little earlier, but I mean, clearly Mr. Scheer is tapping into something here. And is there an audience in this country that says, look, we have problems of our own to take care of? And this comes up, it seems to me, in every election, that there's always this conversation around, if we have money to spend, shouldn't we be spending it at home? So what's the argument for the value of spending it outside the country as well?
Well, I mean, the value is simply one of doing our part. It's important that we invest in making sure that we bolster, I think, people-to-people ties. We help the very needy. I think when Canadians know how little we already put into this, and again, it's under the Harper years, it was actually higher than the Trudeau years. We just continue to keep going down and down, which is something we need to point out. Scheer is actually proposing to cut it even further. So we're not only getting well below the G7 average, we're also increasingly less and less than we did in previous years, particularly when you compare it to our overall GNP or GDP. So it's really just quite a shame. We are one that looks like we talk a big game about being this, good partner in the global system, but we don't actually contribute very much. And I think that's really shameful. But add to that, where the benefit comes in is opening markets, increasingly creating good relationship with people who are going to be hopefully, important consumers, for our goods. I mean, I point out that Africa is the #1 place that we contribute foreign aid. I mean, look at the way China's strategy is of putting lots of money in Africa, because they know that's where the future growth is going to be in terms of a billion-plus marketplace. So it is, very beneficial to us in the long term, but it's very short-sighted to look at foreign aid as just a simple, dollar figure. There's an investment here in creating markets and in creating good relationship with other people.
And if there is a concern around who's getting the Canadian aid, and maybe they might be some countries that Canadians don't really appreciate that, but they may be viewed as, quote, hostile countries to Canada's values or interests. Do we have examples where this country has maintained that kind of aid and contribution to the people of those countries and had it pay off in the long run?
Well, there's many great stories in the international sort of development context. I mean, you look at South Korea, that was a major recipient of aid 40, 50 years ago, which is now one of our major trading partners in Canada. I mean, look at Rwanda, that was after the genocide in, the most terrible of states, and that is presently an example to many. There's still a lot to do in Rwanda, but an example to many on the African continent. I think there's a lot of good examples of how aid makes a difference, and I think it's also really important to point out that Canada played such a leading role historically over, since in the post-war era, building a multilateral order that we could prosper in as a country. Canada does well when the world does well, and that's part of our contributions, and that's what's really noteworthy about this conversation that we're talking about in an election. Canadians really do value international assistance. Our polling shows that. It's over 80% of Canadians that actually support international assistance. They don't prioritize it over healthcare or other things, but they also misunderstand how much we contribute. We do not contribute as much as people think. It's sort of pocket change. Like, we contribute 28 cents on $100 in our economy to international assistance, and we're talking about cutting that. So really, as Stephen was saying, it would be going from comparing ourselves to others out there. In the OECD, we'd be going from ranked 15th to 19th if we were to cut a quarter of our international assistance budget. And that's a major sort of rollback. As the world is facing more authoritarianism, attacks on human rights defenders, Canadian values are being challenged internationally. We have a role to play in contributing to that. And our pullback signals something to our partners internationally as well.
Yeah. Professor Moyer, you're nodding on that. Do you want to add something to it?
Well, one thing that I find particularly problematic is this idea that we shouldn't do things for people abroad until we've helped people at home. And there's this idea we're going to cut the money that goes abroad, and we're going to use it to reduce people's, heating costs or
cut their taxes, provide more tax credits.
Yeah, and that's a populist approach. And it's this idea that you can only do one and you can't do both. We certainly, even if we don't want to increase the deficit, even if we want to reduce the deficit, if we need to cut, there are other places we can cut. We can cut the defense budget. We can cut subsidies to the oil and gas sector, which are about $3 billion a year. So this idea that it has to come from foreign aid. I mean, Canada has enough money. We're a wealthy country. Our economy is doing well. We have enough money to take care of people at home and to provide assistance internationally. And it's not just something we do because it's nice. It's actually an obligation as a wealthy country to provide assistance.
Let me pivot slightly here, Professor Momani, and ask you, I mean, this is the headline of the day on the foreign aid side and on Canada's role in the world. But we haven't heard anything else about that largely in the campaign. It's been you think of Canada-U.S. relations, it's been a dominant issue for the last 3 or 4 years in this country, and we're hearing almost nothing about it on the campaign. So we're talking about this today, and that's important, but what else are we missing?
Well, so much of the debate about foreign policy is missing. I mein, this is a big part of it, of course. Foreign aid is a big piece of that. But generally, we don't really hear a lot about what potential what candidates, if they become in government, what they want to do. Notably, NDP says very little. Jagmeet Singh, I think, doesn't talk much about foreign policy. It's not his strong suit. The Trudeau government released, or the platform of the Liberal Party that released some interesting ideas, but very, very weak. I mean, I think about 5 or 6 points on foreign policy, including the fact that we are going to take 250 people, very vulnerable people, akin to what we saw with the white helmets of Syria brought to Canada as refugees. But generally speaking, I would say we've seen very little from all 3 major parties of what they're going to do when it comes to foreign aid and international affairs, generally speaking.
And what are we losing because of that?
Well, I think we lose a lot in terms of a substantive conversation about how it impacts us here. I mean, we can't have a conversation about the environment, about immigration, about the economy without going into a lot of these international affairs issues. They are very, connected to those matters, and I think it is a disservice to Canadian voters, and we don't actually have our candidates really talking about how they would handle these very important files, because they do impact us here at home very much so.
Nick Moyer, what's your thought? I mean, we're having the conversation today, but it is somewhat in isolation on the one issue, and it's a strong suit for all of you, I know. But what are we missing in the campaign?
Well, I have to echo the points that Bessma Momani made. I think really foreign policy is absent. And really, if you talk to all the subsectors of Canadian foreign policy, whether you're talking about trade, security, aid, I mean, really there's a lack.
We've been forgotten.
We've been forgotten, but where's the coherence and where's the investment? The decisions need to be made, and we need to be stable in our commitments internationally so that our partners can trust us and that we can build towards a better world that serves Canadians. Foreign policy is a vector towards national interest. And in the aid world, it's hard for us to talk about that, but there is an enlightened self-interest in that, those investments allow us to build the future that we want to see for Canadians as well. And so we do benefit here in Canada, I think, in important ways, and we're not talking about that. So maybe this is the one thing that comes from this, that there's an opportunity for us to elevate the conversations around international assistance.
Great. Professor Brown, a final word to you.
Well, though I'm not happy with this proposal to cut aid by 25%, I am happy that it has brought foreign aid and international affairs onto the agenda for this election. I think that, the fact that we're here today talking about it is a good thing for the Canadian debate.
Well, and I'm happy you made the time to have this discussion. Thanks to all of you. Do appreciate it, and we'll talk again, and we'll see if this issue and others related to foreign policy get a little more attention. Thank you.
Thank you.